Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Odell, and I'm with the Center for Faith and Opportunity Initiatives at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or what we like to call the Partnership Center. We're delighted that you've joined us today for another webinar in our series on mental illness. This webinar today will focus on understanding childhood trauma and what faith and community leaders can learn to help individuals struggling with trauma. I'll more fully introduce our speakers in a moment, but first a few housekeeping notes. This is an educational webinar, which is off the record and not intended for press purposes. If you're a member of the press, we would be happy to connect you with the press office here at HHS after the program. If you're having difficulty hearing us clearly, you may find it helpful to call the number provided through the Zoom webinar platform rather than listening through your computer. We have found that sometimes it just works better for sound quality. Note as well that the sound quality may be affected by the type of connection that you have to the internet or the device that you're using, so make sure your volume is increased on the device that you're using. For those who have requested, we will be sending a link to the recording as well as links to the presentations at the end of the webinar, or in the follow-up email to the webinar. So please make sure to look for that follow-up email to be coming to your inbox soon. That will have a link to the recording of the webinar as well as a link to the PowerPoint slides and a number of other resources that we think will be helpful. And if you have any questions or additional items that you'd like to see, let us know at the email address partnerships@hhs.gov. That's partnerships, plural, at hhs.gov. And finally, we do have a full program today, and we hope to get as many questions as possible. What I want you to do is look in the Zoom platform. There should be a section for Q&A, Q&A. That's where you can enter your questions. A lot of you are already chatting, and that's great in the chat feature, but I want to make sure you know that the questions go into the Q&A or the question and answer tab. So let's go ahead and try to use that right now. If you go over to the Q&A, make sure you're going to Q&A and not chat, and type in what city and state you're from. Go over to that Q&A. Excellent. I see a lot of people doing it in the Q&A. Make sure you're using Q&A for questions and then chat for just back and forth dialogue. Q&A is that will help us get to those questions at the end of the webinar. But I see lots of people coming in. I see Kentucky, Wisconsin, Delaware, Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Phoenix. That's great. So really, we have people from around the country joining us for this webinar today. We're so excited. Lastly, if you participate in the webinar today or are interested in receiving a certificate of participation, please email us after the webinar is over. We'll make sure to get that to you through email. So let's get to our webinar today. Trauma. Specifically, trauma experienced as children or adolescents can specifically impact individuals across their entire lives. In fact, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network notes that survivors of childhood trauma are more likely to have long-term health problems or at higher risk to die at earlier age than their peers. This webinar today will focus on important factors impacting many people who are struggling with mental illness concerns, untreated childhood trauma, and can help you consider steps that can be taken by faith and community leaders to address trauma. As a part of those steps, we'll acknowledge the spiritual and religious implications for trauma and how those impact the ability of faith communities to address that trauma. Our goals are to equip local faith and community leaders with the signs and symptoms of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and provide the proven resources that they can use to incorporate into their congregational community outreach efforts. On today's webinar, we're specifically highlighting a model for addressing trauma that is specific to the Christian faith tradition as one of the few programs we've found that is addressing trauma from a faith-based perspective with a rigorous science and research undergirding it. If you're aware of other faith-based models that address trauma from other or multiple faith perspectives, we invite you to tell us more about those programs at partnerships@hhs.gov. To help us consider what we need to know and what we need to do, we're joined today on our webinar by two wonderful presenters who I'm going to take a quick minute to introduce, Alice Forrester and Phil Monroe. Alice is the Executive Director of the Clifford Beers Clinic in New Haven, Connecticut. Clifford Beers Clinic, or CBC, is a $16 million 200 staff, and 104-year-old program that is community-based and a mental health center for excellence for the treatment of children and families. CDC has been a clinical recovery response for the Sandy Hook shootings in 2012. Alice is on the board of the Connecticut Community Providers Association. She's the past president of the Association for Drama Therapy and has held a number of other positions. She's also served as a principal investigator on multiple grants and been involved in a wide range of programs and projects. She's also been involved at the state and national level in a variety of commissions and programs. So we're so excited to have her on to help us understand a little bit more about childhood trauma and how to understand it, the different names for it, and how we better understand what's going on for many children in their lives. Phil Monroe, who's joined us, is a licensed psychologist and the director of training and materials for trauma healing at the American Bible Society. He is the Taylor Visiting Professor of Counseling and Psychology at Missio Seminary, where he led the Graduate School for Counseling and Global Trauma Recovery Institute for 18 years. Dr. Monroe joined Diane Langberg, PhD and Associates in the year 2000. His areas of specialty include sexual addictions and therapy, anxiety, marital distress, and consultation and spiritual renewal for pastors, elders, and their families. His personal and professional musings can be found at philipmonroe.com, and we'll send you a link to some other resources as well that he provided for us in the email. So without further delay, let me turn this presentation over to our two wonderful presenters. Alice, go ahead.
Thank you. We're just going to load up our presentation, and I'm honored to be here today. And great. So is that showing up okay?
Looks great. Go ahead, Alice.
Okay, thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. My clinic is located in New Haven, Connecticut. As Ben said, we're 104, almost 106 years old. And we primarily focus on treating children and families, in particular children and families who have experienced trauma. And we have learned over the years that trauma is something that is insidious, intergenerational, and really can lead to lifelong health impacts. And so we've been piloting quite a few different programs to address that. We are an advocacy center. Our founder, Clifford Beers, was the founder of the mental health movement in the country at the turn of the century. And so we have a long legacy of advocating for folks in the community to receive mental health services, and child trauma has been our focus over the last few years. As Ben mentioned, we've been the recovery effort in the new Sandy Hook school when they reopened. So we have learned a lot about what it's like to be within a school of helping folks recover from a specific event. And we've been replicating some of the model in our New Haven public schools. Our focus here at the clinic has been very much like the new focus in the Affordable Care Act and the movement in healthcare to address the physical, mental, and social determinants of health. And when you're talking about trauma or adversity, you certainly do hit on all those three areas. I think that all of us, and I'm sure that people who are listening today have varying understanding and experience, much more maybe than I do, of trauma, but I think we all want our children to be happy and thriving. You know, of course, in order to do that, they have to have good mental health, and that's a little bit harder to recognize, because you can certainly have the kids who are standing out and showing us that they're having difficulty, but we have a lot of little ones who are sitting in the back of the classroom quite quiet, sort of distracted and not paying attention. And we need to almost address adversity and trauma from our perspective, from a public health perspective. If we know children are in distress, we know that we have to address it quickly, immediately, and we know that people can recover. We know that chronic stress, we use the word stress a lot in our community. That's what our folks in our community use. You'll hear the word, lots of different words used, but we know that chronic stress can interfere with healthy development. We know that it can have health and developmental consequences, neurobiological consequences. I just wanted to define what we mean by adversity. You'll hear me use the adverse childhood experiences. That's a study coming out of Kaiser Permanente, but just so that we're clear on what can be defined as adversity. We find at our mental health center, we treat about 6,000 kids a year. Bereavement and separation is the first and top adversity that our kids feel, but it really runs the gamut from domestic violence, certainly, unfortunately, school violence, including school shootings, community violence, sexual abuse, war, terrorism, children who are coming in through refugee centers, kidnapping. So we find our the highest number of traumas we're finding averaging between 7 and 9 adversities or traumas that our kids are exposed to. Just so that we're clear, there are lots of ways, as I mentioned earlier, you can call, you'll hear it referred to. Research over the last 25 years has really looked at the neurological and epigenetic consequences of trauma, but you'll hear complex trauma used, chronic stress. The pediatric community has decided to really focus on calling it toxic stress. You'd hear adverse childhood experiences, child traumatic stress, post-traumatic stress disorder. So there are lots of words, allostatic load. So these are words that you'll hear in the community, you know, from professionals and in the mental health journals. But in reality, we find our families use the word stress, and stress can mean I can't pay my light bill, or it could mean, you know, my son was arrested last night. So we can really, that word has a lot of meaning for various people. We know often people are relatively reluctant to share the information. That's things that's happening to them, what stays in the home, keeps in the home. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which was started at Kaiser Permanente, and the CDC ran a sample of about 18,000 actual middle class, predominantly white Caucasian individuals from the San Diego area. And they basically just asked 10 questions of folks who were seeking healthcare at Kaiser Permanente. Has any of these 10 adversities, have you experienced parental substance abuse or interpersonal violence? And the series of 10 questions, they're called the ACEs questionnaire. And you can find that questionnaire all over the internet. Actually, if you looked it up today, there's a wonderful website called ACEs Too High, and it has a lot of the most recent information around adversity. Or if you go onto the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, you can also get more information. But the most important thing is that they found a distinct relationship between folks who had 3 or more adverse childhood experiences and mental health and physical health problems. Now, this is not an individual predictor. So if you've had 7 adversities, does not predict you're going to have depression or substance abuse issues. But in aggregate, as a population health study, they found that if you had 3 or more adversities, you were well, actually, a couple things that are interesting. If you, they know that we know this now after 25 years of study, about 64% of folks in America have at least one adverse childhood experience exposure. And we also know that folks who have at least one are statistically about 87% likely to have 2 or more ACEs. So they are combinations of ACEs that lead to greater exponential synergy, they call it, of 2 or more ACEs, so that the combined effect can be greater than some of the individual effects. So a person can have mood disorder, anxiety disorder, substance abuse, impulse control. They also found heart disease, stroke, breathing, COPD, diabetes, and sexually transmitted diseases. And you think, why is this? We know that chronic stress can lead to inflammation, which then can cause a whole series of biological problems within the body. But we also know, as Dr. Folletti, who was one of the authors of the ACEs study with Robert Anda, he says, you know, we have good enough coping strategies. So smoking is a good enough coping strategy for folks who have high levels of chronic stress until it's not good enough anymore, and then it leads to COPD or stroke or heart disease. Eating, you know, sometimes is a very comforting activity until it can lead to metabolic disorder, and folks then are you know, feeling unhealthy and poor self-esteem. So you know, we have very good coping mechanisms to deal with stress until they really don't work for us anymore. How ACEs work is very simple. So the adversity experiences in the ACE study are, have you experienced abuse or neglect, or was there household dysfunction? The impact on the child's development, we know that there are absolute biological, neurobiological effects. There's a stress hormone dysregulation. We know that there are psychosocial effects, meaning people have difficulty attaching if they're living in highly dangerous, unsafe environments. People are not to be trusted, and so there's poor socialization, feelings of not being able to be effective or complete things because they're, you know, constantly up against these adversities. We also know, as I mentioned earlier, that the health risks are, you know, smoking, obesity, substance abuse, sexual promiscuity can be coping strategies that can lead to other health risk behaviors. The long-term consequences can lead, not always, and as I said, this is not a predictor on an individual level, but we know statistically to disease and disability, and also to social problems, homelessness, criminal behavior, unemployment, parenting problems. The other thing that we know is that ACEs is has a generational impact. We understand that child abuse, chronic stress can happen. We understand that aggression and conduct problems can then occur, which can result in problems with school, which then can result in school dropout, re-victimization, depression, anxiety, and then as they grow into adulthood, running into problems with parenting again, domestic violence, and then can lead to, again, a child experiencing high levels of adversity. So if you have a child with you who has experienced a lot of adversity, often you can look back in the generations to see other places. So the real question has been at Clifford Beers, and I think all of us, is what do we do to stop the impact? And what you really want to do, you hear a lot of dialogue around it, resiliency, and the thing I want to just point out is that resilience is ordinary, it's not extraordinary. We learn it by experiencing problematic things and recovering from that. And really what resilience is being able to adapt well to adversity. And being resilient doesn't mean that you don't experience difficulty or sadness, emotional pain, but the road to resilience is likely to include a lot of that distress. And it's important to know that resilience is not a trait. It's not something that you're born with. It doesn't mean that, oh, this person's more resilient than others. It's a learned behavior, thoughts and actions, and the resilience can be developed. It's often developed in resilient environments that are not reactive or built to eject or reject people who are living under high levels of stress, but it really is that our community, our schools, our families are aware of the high levels of stress, and we adjust our behavior in order to support people we work with. Clifford Beers has focused pretty much on about 5 areas of addressing adversity and stress. Increasing the ability to attach to others, helping folks manage their emotional regulation, addressing basic needs, which I'll get into in a minute, and encouraging community connections. So the ability to attach, most often trauma adversity occurs within the intimate interpersonal life of folks, and they learn that the world is a dangerous place, and this can really cause a lot of problems in attachment. And it really only takes one person to encourage a child to learn how to trust others. And so the ability to give and feel love can be learned at any age. Our hope is that kids who have exposed high levels of trauma meet people in their life who they can feel safe with and secure and develop positive relationship. We absolutely know that we need to have our environments very focused on being safe. And unfortunately, a lot of our school environments, become unsafe because there's a lot of expectation for productivity and performance. And kids who have experienced high levels of chronic stress really need you to be thinking not what's wrong with this kid, but I wonder what happened to this child. And so we've done a lot of work in our communities to really educate providers, faith leaders, people in the community to really think about, geez, I wonder what's going on with this child, because their behavior, they feel that they're unsafe or emotionally dysregulated. Emotional regulation is, we have so many methods to be able to teach that now in our communities. Learning and recognizing what are your emotions, knowing the difference between anxiety or excitement or anger or happiness and joy, knowing how to recognize those feelings and emotions in others. A lot of our kids who have experienced high levels of stress and adversity just see, any emotion as anger. Why are you mad? What's going on? They don't understand that there's a whole alphabet of feelings. And so really teaching our children how to express emotions and to understand them and other people are very critical to addressing adversity. And probably most important to trauma is to have loving, accepting communities that are not avoidant around talking about these bad things that happen to our kids, that we're not a punishing environment, but rather a restorative environment where we know that people make mistakes and that children are living under distress, and that we want to really create a world that folks can experience a kindness, loving kindness, and hope through our community. But unfortunately, I think we live in a society that tends to not talk about the bad things. We have messages that you keep those bad things quiet. You talk about them only at home, or you don't talk about them at home. And I think that there needs to be a public health approach to trauma and adversity, educating people on the lifelong health consequences, as well as really understanding that it is within our community that we can really make the changes and repair and create resilient environments for our children. And within the faith community, it's been, I've seen it in folks, who have experienced high levels of trauma, finding loving kindness, benevolence, human connection within their faith communities is really, has been one of the most healing environments for folks who have experienced high levels of trauma. And the invitation that of our faith communities for the teens and our kids to join early and to find hope and happiness through connections with others through our faith communities. So I'm going to sign off right now and let everyone move over to the next presentation, and I think we'll take some questions and answers later.
Thanks, Alice. And as Bill comes on and joins us here in a second, Bill, we can't see you right now. There you go. And your videos, or we don't see you on camera. There you go. Excellent. Just a reminder to type in your questions into the Q&A feature if you have anything you'd like to ask Alice or Phil about, and we'll make sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. So thanks so much. Bill, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Alice. And picking up from there, I want to talk about the impact of childhood trauma on adult faith and spirituality. We're talking about ACEs and what happens to children, and that has reverberations in all parts of their lives, as we were just looking at, including their faith, spirituality, religious experiences, both as a child, adolescent, but then as an adult as well. As I was introduced before, I am the Director of Training and Materials at the Trauma Healing Institute, which is a project of the American Bible Society and many other organizations that have agreed to work in this particular model that I'll describe near the end. There are some ways to contact me. These slides, as some of you have asked, will be made available, and the recording will be made available. So you can look at this later, but philipmonroe.com, dianelangberg.com are some of my contact points. So in many of the descriptions about the effect of childhood trauma on children, we often hear about cognition, brain development, behavior, their mental health, their relationship, their emotional functioning, their physical well-being. One thing that is sometimes missing, and maybe even frequently missing in the discussion, is the impact on their faith and spiritual experiences. And so that's what I'm going to focus on here on my time. Back in the mid-1990s, Ken Pargament, Harold Koenig, and others were doing work on understanding how coping with stress, and it wasn't so much about trauma, because trauma was still a conversation that wasn't happening very much, but they were looking about how faith, spiritual, and religious coping affect mental health and recovery from mental health distress. And they found quite frequently that actually faith and religious coping helped both with mental health and physical recovery and sped recovery in many people. It wasn't always a straightforward line, but it was there. And so this book really launched and really is the basis for all these other books that you'll see on top, where now we have spiritually oriented psychotherapy, Islamically integrated psychotherapy, Buddhist, Jewish, spiritually oriented interventions. There is also even a book, you can see there, an edited volume on Christian counseling and trauma. There are many. These are all I could fit on my slide. There are journals. The American Psychologist has supported, APA has supported spiritual competency. So there's been a lot of work that's come out of this and really taken off in the last 5 to 10 years. Probably helps that we do a little bit of definition here. Unfortunately, faith, spirituality, and religion aren't easily defined as separate things. They are overlapping like this Venn diagram, and you'll see and hear different people talk about these three terms in similar and yet divergent ways. So some people might talk about faith as knowing, spirituality as more of a being, and religion more as doing. That's fairly uncomfortable because they're so overlapping. So maybe we can today at least accept these fuzzy boundaries, that spirituality and being is more of a relationship with the divine and a search for the sacred. Whereas religion, and more the doing side, has a community focus and a structured set of beliefs and practices. Again, they resist these strict definitions, but at least recognize that the terms mean different things and can mean different things for different people. So one of the first things that we want to think about is what effect does faith, spirituality, and religion have on mental and emotional health? And it has been found to be associated, these practices, experiences have been found to be associated with some positive and sometimes negative influences on recovery from crises and influence of positive mental health. So let me just highlight a couple of things. Tama Bryant Davis is one author who has written on these factors, and actually my last slide has a bibliography with a couple of her works on it that you can look at either at the end or when you get the slides later. What she helps bring out is the fact that positive religious coping seems especially to help with helping someone derive meaning and purpose, either during worship or their engagement of God in private. So there is a meaning making that goes on that seems to help people recover more quickly. You can understand that oftentimes these practices are done in community, and so that there can be a community bonding that also helps people recover. They're not just making meaning in isolation of others, but with others and feeling supported and that their pain is acknowledged. But faith, spirituality, religion isn't always positive, and Ken Pargament has articulated some of the things that show up across a variety of faith traditions, religious traditions. And it seems that when a person experiences the divine or God as angry and ominous, or they feel rejected, or they feel desecrated, and some of their spiritual practices are much more passive, more of a waiting, there's nothing I can do, that these tend to be associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, and even early death. So you can see that some practices, some experiences, some beliefs, some things seem to be associated with more a quicker recovery, and other things seem to cause people to feel more stuck or to even get worse. Don Walker, who I think at the time was at Regent, but has, I think, gone on, but had looked at a number of studies to see if actually crises improve a person's faith and faith experience. And the data, as you might expect, is mixed. Looking at 34 studies that met his criteria, he found that 14 seemed to have a significant disruption of faith. They found a significant disruption of faith. 12 seemed to have more mixed evidence. Some things got better, some things got worse regarding their faith and spiritual experiences. And 8 studies seemed to have a more positive impact. There's a lot you can unpack in these things. He found that age, gender, socioeconomic status had some impact on whether or not one's faith grew stronger or grew weaker as a result of the crisis that they went through. Nonetheless, and across all of these, I think it's really helpful to understand this, that no matter whether in the end your faith and spiritual experiences help you recover more quickly through a crisis, or they tend to maybe cause the crises to get a little bit worse, that most people go through 2 spiritual struggles that have been articulated as both a discontent with my previous way of articulating my faith, my religious practices, and an increase in questioning, a questioning of what I knew. So the way I articulated God, or the way my faith seemed to articulate myself, now has come into question. I don't know if I can continue believing what I believed. It's disrupted myself. You can see it creates an existential angst. And so it begs the question in our faith communities, what does our faith community say about God in times of crisis and trauma? Does it speak about it at all? Does it acknowledge it? It really leads to this kind of experience, I think, for many people. And I really like this quote or poem from Rumi. I was ready to tell the story of my life, and by the way, my faith and spiritual experiences helped me tell my story of my life. But now the ripple of my tears and the agony of my heart won't let me. There you can see, I need to tell, I can't tell, and I don't exactly know how my previous ways of narrating myself and my life and of the universe and of who God is, whether it actually works. That's just in general about adults and children, adolescents experiencing trauma and beginning to have an impact on their faith. I think we need to take it one step further. Many children who have experienced adverse childhood experiences also have experienced something that we call a betrayal trauma. This is where someone who is supposed to care well for them, a parent figure, a relative, a teacher, and sadly, clergy member or a church leader or a faith community leader have been part of the trauma, have either committed injustices against them or have allowed it to be committed to them. And so betrayal trauma can lead to what we call complex post-traumatic stress disorder, complex trauma. And there are a number of factors that may show up when this happens. And what we see across the board is that, for the most part, children and adolescents who experience betrayal trauma struggle a lot more in faith communities and their own understanding of their faith. You can see, here are some of the 7 features that show up in complex trauma. And I'm not going to talk about these, but just notice the 7th one, perception of meaning and faith, is disrupted at an early point of life before it gets established of who am I and who is God or who is my faith community. And that's difficult to recover as a child grows up. So what helps? There are many things that we could talk about, could have spent the whole hour on this, but I'm only going to highlight 2 things that faith communities especially may be able to support as part of the resilience or even post-traumatic growth subsequent to trauma. That is meaning making and finding safety within connection in their communities. So I want to highlight just one type of meaning making, and that is lament. Lament shows up in a variety of places. It shows up in the Hebrew Bible. It shows up in epic poems such as Beowulf or the Iliad. In the Shia sect of Islam, there is a lament for Imam Hussein, who was murdered, and there are religious practices as part of these laments. In the Hebrew Bible, about 1/3 of the book of Psalms are lament psalms. And these are communal complaints about injustice and loss and pretty tough questioning that comes back to God. There is an ask for a rescue and a calling on God to fulfill his promises and a wait for him to act. And you can see here, how much longer will you forget me, Lord? Forever? How much longer will you hide yourself from me? Some accusations even that don't always turn out at the end of the poem or the song or the lament to say, yeah, but I know it's going to work out. So here are some ways you can imagine in a community, if I am able to articulate the pain and the questions and the confusion and the struggles that I have, and my community is able to support that, encourage it, even say it with me, I am going to feel a lot more connected, more attached, and potentially able to articulate a new set of meaning that may be different from what I used to narrate myself from. Elie Wiesel, you probably know him and his book Night, in the part of the first book of the trilogy. Spent 10 years not talking about his experiences in the Holocaust, but he talks about this. I have not lost my faith in God. I have moments of anger and protest, and sometimes I've been closer to him for that reason. Does it help people? There is a scant research on this, but Kim Snow wrote a dissertation on this, and she was exploring college students as they journaled about their questions to God, about the distress in their life. There was anger, there was confusion, there was questions. What they found at the end was there seemed to be an increased communion and intimacy with God, but they still did not reduce their anger and their distress about how they felt about what was happening to them. And Richard Beck talks about this as sort of this holding communion and complaint together into winter of faith, as we're waiting for something new potentially to grow. All of this is very similar, but really it can only happen if you can, within a faith community, develop a sense of safety, a sense that my pain matters. So is there safety? Is there remembering? Does it allow for mourning and lament and grieving? Does it allow for me to reconnect and even develop some level of hope that may look very different from what I thought hope looked like before? Or, unfortunately, sometimes in our faith communities, is there a silence, a forgetting, a forced reconciliation that leads to isolation and fear? You can imagine how actually one trajectory creates a lot more safety and a sense of potential for growth after trauma. And you can see that even in the trajectory of what I would suggest is more healthy is not a getting past or getting over or removing the consequences of the abuse that may continue in my life for as long as I live. Miroslav Volf, End of Memory, who is a Yale theologian, talks about this. He talks about the fact that, and I can't read my quote because the pictures are in front of it. Let me just move that here. If no one remembers a misdeed or names it publicly, it remains invisible to the outside observer. Its victim is not a victim, its perpetrator is not a perpetrator. Both are misperceived because of the suffering of the one and the violence of the other go unseen. A double injustice occurs. The first, when the original deed is done, and the second, when it disappears. And this really fits with a number of anecdotal evidence that I've collected over the years as a therapist, that people have felt that actually the second wound that they experienced, the second one there, was more painful and destructive to their lives than the first. The rape, the assault was terrible, but when their family member or their faith community leader told them to be quiet about it or that it didn't happen, that was actually the most painful and destructive part. And I remember a district attorney telling me, who was involved in dealing with child abuse cases, having a child ask him once, is God on his side? Because the clergy were sitting on the perpetrator's side and not sitting with the child. So that leads me to just giving you one example. Now, this is an example that comes from a book that turned into a program that's now used in many places, which I'll describe, Healing the Wounds of Trauma, How the Church Can Help. So there are many faith communities that look various things. I'm giving you one example of trying to serve the church to make the church a safer place for traumatized children, adolescents, and adults. You can imagine that if you are raised in a church, that you learn things about how the world was made from the creation stories, and there is order in the world, there is justice, and I'm valuable to God and others. But unfortunately, when trauma happens, you lose track of these. You feel isolated, you feel rejected. Those facts no longer seem to work. Yeah. You feel disconnected from your community. You feel disconnected from your previous sense of self. So how do you ever get back to there, if that's at all possible? Well, this program tries to, in small group settings, using 5th grade language or less, using lay leaders and discussions, tries to help people understand what trauma is. It's a deep wound to the heart, much like a physical wound. It has some of the same properties and experience. It takes a long time to heal, and it hurts every part of us, our relationships, our bodies, our thoughts, and our faith. And we have some evidence by doing some research on about 2,700 people before they entered this program and then afterwards. But before, they acknowledged that those who had experienced trauma often found their faith disrupted and their sense of safety and connection in the church disrupted. We describe how traumatized people tend to behave. They tend to relive events. They tend to avoid things that reminds them of that event, and they find themselves always on alert. So there is discussions and normalizing of how trauma might affect a person. When a person begins to find some light on the subject and begin to feel connected, it often happens in a group setting. It often happens in community. It often happens in a place where my story and I matter. And in our Healing the Wounds of Trauma, How the Church Can Help, it is a small group activity. It's not therapy, it's a discovery conversation where we look at culture, we look at stories, we start to understand basic mental health practices and what's happening to ourselves, and look at how the scriptures might be of help and how we've understood them and what practical helps we can apply to ourselves and to each other. So it's conversational. It's grounded in story, explores a culture, scripture, and there's a practical application in it. It's grown from just something that is for adults that started in East and Central Africa in the late 90s and was first published in the early 2000s, to now have a children's trauma healing program that, of course, has a lot more play and activity involved in it. A story-based trauma healing, which is really for oral communicators and listeners, who aren't focused on the written word. It exists in a form of audio dramas and conversations that play in East and Central Africa primarily, and play on radios and listening devices. And there is a recent teen version that's an urban story set and is right now being training of trainers in Sri Lanka, El Salvador, and soon to be here in the United States. So it is international. It's in about 100 countries, contextualized, translated. There are about 13,000 lay facilitators who are using this in their communities, maybe their churches, maybe under a tree, maybe in their homes. And you can see this is out of date in some ways. It's existing most maturely in East and West Africa, but also around the world. Okay, so that's a little bit about this program and what it's like. It's, by the way, it's used in a wide variety of Christian expressions of church and experience, from Orthodox to Protestant, Catholic to Pentecostal. And it has also been used in places where it's engaging with people of other faiths as well. So I'll stop there and stop sharing in just a second. But you can see this bibliography, the Tammy Bryant Davis and the Don Walker things, but you can find this and write this down later when the slides come out to you after it's all done.
Bill, Alice, thank you so much for all this amazing content and presenting it in such a quick way so that we have time for some of these amazing questions that have come in. So thank you so much both for your presentations and the wealth of knowledge that we've gained as a result of your discussions. I'm going to go through some questions that we already have. Feel free to keep those questions coming in, and I promise we'll get to as many as we can. Alice, could you give some concrete examples, and I think you did this a little bit, but it came up as a question, some examples of childhood trauma. So for instance, some people noted and asked about whether or not hospitalization or medical interventions is a trauma for children. And I thought you'd be able to speak to that as helping people understand what some of those different elements, what specific examples of childhood trauma can be.
Sure. First of all, in response to medical trauma, that definitely is on the list of traumas that can greatly impact a person in their experience of the world. It also can impact the siblings and other folks that are related in the family, living through a medical trauma, both of a child or a parent. So absolutely, that is an adversity and something that can cause stress. You know, the ones that we normally think of are domestic violence, sexual abuse, community violence, school violence. But someone in the questions was asking a little bit around high pressured environments that are not so much related to poverty, but high parental expectation or you know, school pressures. I mean, we have our kids who live under these very high pressured lives where they're supposed to be, you know, doing well in school, getting into the best schools. And so, you know, unfortunately, we see our kids living with that high level of chronic stress, parental disappointment, and that can be also considered, you know, a high level of stress that a kid is living under.
So Alice, to that point and to that questioner, like a later question, I think they talked about how some children respond to trauma and have that amount of resilience that it then allows them to kind of be high functioning. So I think one part of the question was, can someone who experiences trauma have enough resilience built up so that they don't have as many of the mental health conditions present? And also, like, what does it look like to facilitate resilience within children so that they can respond to trauma in as healthy ways as possible?
Great. I think the first part is exactly true. You know, person A can have experienced the same thing as person B, and you know, why does person B suffering perhaps with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, or depression, or poor health consequences, and person A is not? You know, we know a little bit about it. One is that it may be that in the person A's life, the child A's life, they may have people in the community that see them, that recognize them, that understand that they're living under stress and can see the light and the love in this child, in this person. Whereas maybe the second child may not be surrounded by a positive reinforcing community. It could be that the child B could be exhibiting a lot of negative behaviors related to their chronic stress, whereas the first child may have, you know, a better physical presence and or feeling more confident, and the other child may not present that way, and people sort of maybe put him in a, you know, he's a bad kid or she's a bad kid category. So, you know, I think that there's personal resilience that, you know, you're born with hope and perhaps faith or connection. But there's also environments that are different, and that the children who are living in a more hopeful environment with positive reinforcement do better no matter what kind of exposure they have had.
Thanks, Alice. Well, we're on this topic of what are some types of betrayal. Phil, you mentioned betrayal trauma specifically. And so could you share a little bit more about what are the specific elements of a trauma that is of a betrayal in nature, and how that relates to some of the things you were talking about?
Yes, it's primarily when someone who is supposed to provide care and love and nurture does the opposite. So betrayals can happen in all sorts of ways. So maybe a person goes to their, you know, think about it this, an adolescent goes to their youth pastor to talk about their difficulties in life, and the youth pastor betrays the safety that should be there and may engage in sexual behavior with this child, groom them in a particular way. That could happen. Or somebody goes to someone else, and that person betrays the confidence and spreads information and gossip. It can happen all sorts of ways. It can happen from a parent figure that I expect is going to look out for me, who ends up attacking me in a coercive way. An uncle who's supposed to look out for me, who sexually abuses me. So betrayals can happen like that. So that now my basic essence of what I expect in life no longer works.
Yeah, and that creates so many challenges for trusting systems, trusting other people, forming attachments and relationships. It kind of cascades in the number of impacts.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing about that. You can think about a difference between an accident, which doesn't cause me to doubt my family, versus a trauma that causes me to doubt my family. Now everything is unsafe.
Wow. With some of these challenges, we've talked about how they can have impacts across the life course. So certainly someone can have an instance of childhood trauma, and that goes undiagnosed, and it can present in various ways. And I think part of the question was kind of how soon can mental health systems show up as it relates to childhood trauma? I mean, I think the answer is all ranges, right? It can show up right away. It can show up. Yeah, exactly. But any thoughts about some of that, both delay or not delay? I mean, and how to think through understanding some of those long-term impacts as well as the short-term impacts.
I'm sure Phil can talk about it very well, but I think that I feel like I've become an advocate and a strong proponent for this being a public health issue. And that as a public health issue, there needs to be education to the community around what the trauma is and what is adversity. But it also, we need to screen and understand and recognize it early on. You know, so that, you know, we have birth to 4-year-old programs where we're working with moms who have been traumatized and helping, coaching them in parenting so that they don't pass down their attachment worries or issues. And, you know, we really need to start at birth or pre-birth. so that we don't have this intergenerational approach.
Yeah.
I think we need to be in the schools. We need to be assessing, we check vision and, posture and educational issues. We also need to really understand what are some of the things that are affecting our children's learning, so that we're really looking at it from a public health perspective.
And I might just add one little thing, which is that a lot of mental health intervention obviously should be early, but it needs to be in some ways either seasonal or cyclical, because what a 10-year-old needs may change. And when they become 30 and they have a child who is, closing in on the age where they were abused, they may need something else at this point, and they may have different sets of questions.
Very good point.
Yeah. And we're seeking stability for people who've been through trauma, not necessarily healing, and there's all different ways it's going to present, different experiences that people are going to have. So again, Alice, going back to your both, it's environmental in its understanding of trauma, but it's also environmental in its treatment. Both sides are really important. Alice, for you, a question about how well ACEs and adversity is understood in the field, helping people know kind of the prevalence. I mean, I feel like I see trauma-informed everywhere, but let us know and let the people know.
Department of Health and Human Services, right?
That's true. That's true. It makes sense that I would see it everywhere. And then Phil, if you could, after Alice talks to that, speak to your awareness of and what you guys are seeing through ABS as far as awareness of trauma in faith communities. Are you seeing that people have an understanding of that? Is it something that's growing and developing, or is it kind of not there, and you guys are really helping people understand? So kind of a question to you both in your respective communities about the level of understanding about ACEs and trauma.
So I think, I'm sorry, Phil, I'm answering first, but it's been a real extraordinary 20 years since the ACE study has come out, and now I think it's 25 years, and people have really caught on and thought about it. So I think that there's much more public knowledge about it. I think where we're lacking or where we still have growth to do is really, what do you do about it? How do you create environments that are able to hold and heal that broken heart that I think you described so well, Phil, and still hold people accountable in the schools or in work and various activities. So I think we're really looking for models that can do this. A very astute group of folks wrote a paper called "The Best Interests of Society," and in that article they talk about it's not going to be the mental health workers who heal from this or heal this problem in our society, but it's going to be teachers, police officers, faith-based parents. And so I think we need to really move towards a more, even a greater understanding of what you can do. And it's not rocket science. You want to love, you want to connect, you want to share that and hold the space for people's stories. So.
That's really right. In faith communities, since I've been practicing, trauma went from being unknown, actually even to most mental health professionals, but certainly for clergy, to a much greater understanding and a lot more conversation around trauma-informed care. I would also agree what's lacking is, okay, so what do we do? And in the absence of what do we do, what tends to happen is there's more of a telling approach, like, hey, I see you're traumatized. Here's the end result. This is where you need to get for resilience. It's more of a presenting somebody with a picture of health, but no sense of how to get from point A to point B. And so sometimes that actually leaves people a little bit more distressed and dismayed, because they don't know how to get it. And in some communities, there's almost if you want to, you can get here. This idea that healing will be as if this never happened. And so that's not across the board, but I see that. And what's growing is there's a real interest. And so what people are doing is really buying into, I want to know how to help. I want to know how to listen and support. So that's where things stand, I think, at the moment.
That's great. Thank you, Phil and Alex, for that question. Let me say that I've looked through a few of the questions, and a number of you have some very specific questions, maybe even some questions that you're asking for a loved one or someone you know. We always encourage through these webinars, if you have a specific circumstance or situation, to reach out to a mental health professional who can provide advice and support. We want to encourage you to engage with mental health professionals with specific circumstances and situations. As Dr. Monroe mentioned, both trauma healing is not therapy and this webinar is not therapy. Really, the purpose is to help you understand and aware, maybe even help you know some of the words that you can use to talk to mental health professionals about some of the experiences you've had. So we always want to encourage you to connect with a mental health professional to ask some of the questions that I'm seeing come through, trying to get to as many as we can. Just to go a few minutes over, for both of you, for Alice, what are you guys seeing as some of the most effective ways to address trauma? What are the ways you guys are addressing it in Clifford Beers? And then Phil, what's some of the evidence for trauma healing that you guys have seen as being effective in addressing trauma? So if you guys could both speak to the outcomes, the success stories of addressing trauma and what that's looked like.
Sure. You know, there are absolute definite evidence-based practices that are out there. Cognitive behavioral treatment for trauma in the schools, CBITS coming out of the RAND Corporation, is a terrific intervention that we're seeing reduce post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in children. But for Clifford Beers, we believe that the model of care needs to be this way. We want to be able to work with the whole family because of the intergenerational nature of it. We want to be able to find ways to reduce stress by addressing the physical, mental, and social determinants of health. And so, yes, you can have evidence-based treatment for your trauma, but in reality, you want the trauma to stop, and you want to be able to stabilize and have families feel safe and okay. And part of that is addressing basic needs. A lot of our families come where their child has experienced high levels of adversity, sexual abuse, or witnessing domestic violence, but they're on their cusp of being ejected out of their home, or they're homeless, or they haven't any food or lights or heat, you know, just the very basic needs. So we're seeing that you need to address the evidence-based and provide evidence-based treatment, but also coordinate their care. Wraparound care coordination is something we feel very strongly about. And we have some studies that we've shown that we've been able to reduce inpatient utilization by 50% by just looking at the whole family and decreasing the stress by addressing basic needs.
Bill?
Yes, so in our trauma healing program, we have undertaken a couple of research projects. One quantitative, quasi-experimental study looking at before people entered a healing group or an equipping training, which has a healing group attached to it, when they've completed it, and then 2 to 6 months afterwards. There was also a qualitative study done looking at some of the places where it's the most mature. That means it's been around the longest in Uganda and Rwanda. And then, of course, we have a load of anecdotal things as well over the years. The evidence is actually that people, by being in places and participating in a healing group, they may not actually share much of their own story. But they are able to feel that what has happened to them is of value. So we've seen a decrease in some of the trauma symptoms, and we've seen an increase in some of their connection to their faith communities, to church, to the Bible, to God. And so that has actually shown up even with the people with the most trauma symptoms and trauma experiences seem to be able to be helped. The qualitative study shows that one of the things that is showing is that we're hearing that in Sunday schools, in sermons, in all sorts of places, some of the materials are being used and discussed and talked about, so that even if a person never attends a healing group, they've heard someone from the front with authority talk about the fact that there is trauma in the world and that what they're experiencing is not crazy, insane, or some sign that God has rejected them.
We find the same,
Absolutely.
Bill, I'm sorry, just in the schools, just gathering groups of kids, they don't share their trauma stories, but just the idea that other people, they're not alone in the world and that other people have experienced that, we see significant reduction in their post-traumatic stress symptoms. So.
It's really the power of relationships and community that makes such a difference in the lives of people. And so being able to facilitate that, whether or not it's a faith community, a church, and a clinical setting, when we can encourage and facilitate relationship connection, there's so much healing that's possible. So, well, we're already over time. This has been such a wonderful presentation. I want to thank everyone for participating. I want to thank our presenters. I know many people have talked about this has been helpful for me. This has been helpful for my class. This has been helpful for my program that I work with. They want to tell other people about what they've heard today, and I can't think of a better way to do something with the information than to increase awareness about what we've talked about today. Again, the recording of the link of the webinar will be provided to everyone who participated, as well as a link to the slides, which I appreciate our presenters making available. And so, again, I want to thank each of you who are participating today or maybe watching this recording after the webinar because you weren't able to join. Thank you for participating or for watching this webinar. We want to continue to share knowledge and to stay in touch. Be sure to register for our next webinar, which will be focusing on postpartum depression and how faith and community leaders can be aware of the signs and symptoms of this condition. In fact, knowing signs and symptoms could reduce childhood trauma by knowing that moms will have the support that they need. We'll send a link to the register for that follow-up to that webinar in the follow-up email as well, along with a number of resources. If you're not on our mailing list and would like to be so, send us an email to partnerships@hhs.gov. We'll be following up with so many of you to touch base and to know what's going on with your program. And that's it. Thanks so much for joining us today. I hope you'll be able to join one of our future webinars. You can check out our past webinars in this series on our YouTube channel. And we hope to be and stay in touch as we continue to educate people about the challenges and the opportunity to address mental illness in their community. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.